Hi, everyone, and welcome to our first roundtable on our latest issue, Mediterraneans. My name is Saleem Haddad. I'm the fiction editor at the Merkaz Review, and I'm joined by three of the contributors to the issue, Aisha, Abdel, Iason, Athanasiadis, and Gabriela Mitrushi. I loved all of your pieces, by the way, so I'm really happy that you're able to join us to give everyone a bit of an idea of how this will go. So we'll be chatting for about 45 to 50 minutes or so, and then we will open up the space for questions. So if you have questions at any point, please just put it in the Q&A button, which should be visible, I think, if you click the more, the three dots and the more. And so with that said, let's get started. So I was really excited to come on board at the start of this issue because I think the Mediterranean is a region that I've always found very fascinating. And one of the things that we tried to do with this issue here at TMR was to complicate the idea of the Mediterranean as a single coherent place. And in different ways, all the pieces in the issue explore this multiplicity, whether it's through the politics of movement or the tension between paradise and violence, or even through exploring the different ways that multiple histories, emotions, and memories kind of exist and hover in the same space and cities around the Mediterranean. And I feel like with the three writers that we have here, each of your pieces approach these tensions from very different angles, but also very complementary angles at the same time, whether it's through ecological collapse or through fiction and survival in Gaza, or through memory and water and the Mediterranean as this fragile emotional archive of sorts. I hope, Gabriela, that's a good description of your piece, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe as a start, I'd love to hear from each of you. If you could briefly introduce your piece, what drew you towards writing this piece, and why you wanted to contribute to this issue of the Mediterraneans. Maybe, Gabriela, we can start with you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. My piece is called Don't Forget to Say I Love You, Notes on Water. And it's definitely, I think of it as a love letter to the Mediterranean, but it's a love letter that's caught between these tensions of what the Mediterranean is and could be, and particularly caught between what my childhood remembers it as, that very intimate kind of knowledge, that place where I learned to swim, where I was a child, so I felt safe and sheltered by it, to what it is now and how I can understand it as an adult with understandings of the migration, the violence that goes on across many of its borders, and how that is a deliberately created violence. It doesn't have to be that way necessarily, but that is something political choices are being made to enforce and to enact. And kind of what do I do with the love I hold for this place and with the responsibility that I also think that we have towards changing it.
Yes, and do you want to go next? Because I feel like your piece is very complementary actually to Gabriela's piece in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it is for sure. In fact, I paused when reading her piece. I found this sentence where she says, "What are we going to ask our children's children? Why we guarded the sea and poisoned the rivers?" And that was pretty much what I was also trying to answer. I was trying to figure out how has the Aegean, which is the sort of sea between Turkey and Greece, ended up becoming quite as different to what I remember when I was a kid as it has. So my piece is basically an article about how I loaded my motorcycle on a boat one stormy February night and went off to Limnos, which is an island in in the northern Aegean, like right on the entrance to the Dardanelles and the Black Sea. And from there went to Kavala, which is an old Ottoman port from where Muhammad Ali of Egypt comes from, and then continued eventually to Thessaloniki, another old Ottoman and Byzantine and Hellenistic city, and spoke and interviewed captains, fishermen, scientists, mussel farmers, and anybody else that came across my way. So, trying to basically give a snapshot of the Aegean and where it is today.
And Aisha, do you want to tell us a bit about your story? And I'd be curious as well to hear about why you felt you wanted to submit it to the Mediterranean's theme specifically. You submitted to the call, yeah.
I did. Yeah. I'm a fiction writer, so I wrote this short story titled Paradise. And it takes a sort of classic fiction trope, a structure for a short story. It's a day in the life story. And I wanted to explore a day in the life of this young man named Moaz, who is surviving a war, a genocide in a place certainly inspired by current day Gaza. I say inspired because I can't claim to really understand what it's like to be there and survive. But he feels choked, besieged mentally, spiritually, physically, and all the structures that used to uphold his life have fractured. Even his sense of time is ruptured. The story takes place on what would have been his graduation day from university, but he's forgotten. So, this moment that's supposed to signal hope and excitement for the future, um, but instead, of course, there is no university, and he spends the day clearing rubble from a friend's shop. And I think of him as a young man who desperately craves a release from siege. He wants to sort of let his thoughts flow freely without constraint and threat. And so, sort of reflexively, subconsciously, he makes his way to the sea and he hurls himself into it. He submits to its power over him. And so for Moaz, I think the sea is a respite, it's cleansing, it's a way for him to return his own memories to himself. But it's, of course, it's also a cage. It's another sort of frontier of death surrounding him. But when I worked on this story for maybe over a year. And when I saw the call for the Mediterranean's issue, I felt like this piece was almost destined for this issue because, it was important for me that when Moaz, the sea is an opportunity, a mechanism for this young man to unlock his imagination. There's the ruins of his city behind him, but when he looks out at the sea, it is that moment for him where he gets to rage and cry, but also to have fantasies, have memories, right, in this sort of endless expanse of the sea in front of him.
Yeah, I mean, I was very taken by the title Paradise because it kind of in some ways feels ironic, but then also sincere at the same time. And I feel like it also captures this juxtaposition for me when it comes to thinking about the Mediterraneans. I think, Gabriela, you said there are many Mediterraneans in my mind. I kind of feel the same. And for me, it was actually very important to have Gaza feature in the Mediterranean somehow because I think the writer Tariq Bakroni calls it like this, it's become this place of objection, not of like the abject, not just for the world, but even among Palestinians. And yet it is very much not just the sort of the moral center of our world, but very much geographically central, even if we kind of have this image of it as being far away. And I was thinking today actually about the Samud flotillas and how by crossing the Mediterranean, actually, they're really shrinking distance in our minds and reminding us of just how close Gaza is to all of us. But I feel like in different ways, all of your pieces are negotiating between that tension of paradise and ruin. And I'm wondering if maybe each of you would like to talk a little bit about how you negotiated that, whether in the piece or just generally when you think about the Mediterranean, whether we're talking about ecological ruin, whether we're talking about war, whether we're talking about the hypocrisies of movement. Who would like to go first?
I can begin. That's a very big question. And I think it's one that I am constantly grappling with. And I mean, I tried to end my piece on kind of a hopeful note, but the reality is that I don't know how we manage these difficulties and these paradoxes. I think there's a lot of value in working at it, in confronting the Mediterranean as multiple and not letting ourselves kind of sink back into a very easy one-dimensional model of it. But it requires a lot of a lot of grappling with these questions. When I was writing the piece, I wrote it over. I wrote some of it and then I took a break from it for a while while I was going back to schoolwork and then I came back to it. And in the coming back to it, I kind of reread what I had written and was forced to ask myself a lot more questions because even in like every month that passes, I feel constantly I'm having to question myself and push myself to think differently and to imagine differently. And I think from the title of Iason's piece, the question, what have we done, keeps reoccurring to me whenever I think about the Mediterranean, and I don't know how to answer that but what have we done is something that I keep returning to. And I think it's an important question to be asking ourselves and to be calling ourselves into thinking about more.
Yes, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about this from the ecological perspective. I mean, especially in the context of Greece, which is often kind of seen as this, holiday destination, beautiful islands, beautiful seas. But then I think you're kind of touching on something that even you said that, there's like a resistance to want to actually explore what's happening ecologically in the Med.
Yeah, I mean, so Greece is kind of in this in-between place because on the one hand, it's a destination of privileged travelers, holidays. On the other hand, it's a hollowed out, financially sort of hollow vessel after the economic crisis, and it has been turned even, it has been kind of like pushed even more in the tourism industry direction. But on the other hand, there are other places. I mean, Greece, for two other places like Lebanon, like Libya, like Egypt, like Turkey, like the south of Spain, is in a position of privilege as its environment is relatively moderately less degraded than those countries. And so issues that we have um, I don't know, the privilege of ignoring or the ignorance of not engaging with, such as, the interplay, again, Gabriela brings it out in her piece, the way in which, the rivers feed into the sea. And so what we pump into the sea comes from the rivers, which come from industry, which come from one-use plastics that we're constantly consuming every day. Most people do not make these connections. Like maybe 1 in 100 people is aware that the plastic cup that you will, derive 10 swallows of water or juice end up in microplastics that your body's T cells will really struggle to neutralize when they pick up on them being in your body. But they're microplastics, they're not other cells which can be neutralized. So the body will just sort of go into overdrive against more and more and more invasive alien pieces of microplastic. And this is happening on a daily basis until, one develops cancer. And so there was a fascinating study that I came across while researching this piece, which says that in cadavers, dead bodies that were opened between 2018 and 2025, people that had died by 2018 had a radically lower amount of microplastics in their body than people that had died just 7 short years later in 2025. And so for me, the biggest takeaway from this piece, rather than being, something about the Mediterranean itself, even though I was fascinated to learn that the Mediterranean is warming up by 20% more than faster than any other place on Earth, because an internal sea. But the biggest takeaway that I took from this piece was that our criminal use of one-use plastics is basically condemning ourselves, but also those other people who may, like the small minority that opt not to use one-use plastics, basically to cancer. That's the thing that I most like people who have or haven't read my piece to come away with, literally poison ourselves and those other people around us by our use of plastics and quite high are.
And just to follow up, like in your research, have you done work around connecting these, like how much is there around regional cooperation on some of these issues, if anything, given, of course, that many of the countries around the Med are going through their own internal challenges, to put it mildly. Like how much is there in terms of regional cooperation around some of these issues?
I don't have a big picture, so I can't reply, what the EU is doing in an organized way. I don't think very much, actually, or whether there are kind of like trans-Mediterranean bodies, NGOs that are tackling this. But I did interview one NGO that deals with mine, and they're based out of Thessaloniki, which is the city I happen to be in right now. Again, they've been paying fishermen, trawler captains, to basically bring them the tons and tons of plastic that they bring up with their nets. What they used to do was that they used to be like, throw it back into the sea. Now they actually get paid per ton to take plastic, not to the NGO, but just to kind of like, bring it out onto the shore, dump it in an earth dump there. At the same time, these NGOs are looking into the provenance of the plastic. I filmed for this documentary that Arte did a few years ago about Europe, and it was in the ecological environmental episode. And we did a beach cleanup back there on the island of Limnos, where I also visit on this trip, by another NGO. And they were basically kind of like creating maps that showed the provenance of the different types of plastic. In the final documentary, there was a fascinating graphic that actually showed these kind of like swirls of plastic, like emanating from all of these, the south of the Mediterranean, North Africa, and Southern Europe, and just kind of like spreading into the Mediterranean. But we haven't reached in the Mediterranean yet these huge kind of like compact, almost land masses of plastic that you see in the Pacific or the Atlantic.
Gabriela, your piece kind of touches on a lot of these things that Iason is talking about, but I think you approach it obviously from a very different angle. One thing I think you quote at some point, Bhavani Raman, who writes that before landscapes die, they must first vanish in the imagination. And that kind of also made me think about something in Iason's piece about how like everyday Greeks are estranged from the sea, in a sense that even practically when moving around. I'm wondering if you can maybe reflect on that. What kind of drew you to that quote?
Yeah, that was I'm also working on my master's dissertation currently on environmental issues, and particularly on like legal personhood, this idea that natural bodies like rivers and stuff like that could be legal persons in international law to protect them. But part of thinking about that is thinking about how we've become, especially in the West, really estranged from nature, from land, from these life-giving sources like rivers, that we can let the thought that rivers can die, that we've killed rivers, is something that feels very shocking. But the reality is that it's happened to rivers all over, and we're letting it continue to happen. And many other forms of harm compounding in the natural environment and throughout ecosystems. And so that's where that quote kind of comes from. But that is a loss that I think on quite a lot, about what it means that for many of us, the natural world is something very alien and something that we feel very disconnected from, and that life can go on without it. When, at least in my reckoning, the reality is that's not true. We can't, not only for our own well-being should we not pollute our waters and these kinds of things, but also that we owe something to the natural world as we are part of it. And as it is, like I reflect on in my piece, the Mediterranean has nurtured, countless generations of people. It's fed us. It's been the source for so much joy and pain as well, of course, but it feels very much like we are pretending that we can turn our back on the natural world, and we can pretend that we are disconnected and other, but we only are dooming ourselves when we take that kind of attitude forward.
Yeah, there's going to be like this moment of like realization of kind of like dawning horror when all of the current generations that are completely disconnected from the sea, it actually dawns on them like why it was important. Before, you used to have this in the form of folk wisdom or just direct wisdom. People knew it. Either they codified it in their religious belief or their superstitions, or there was just, a kind of an awe, a connection to the sea, a connection to different natural phenomena. People knew that these were incredibly powerful entities and you needed to respect them. Maybe you didn't understand them fully. But now we just have this kind of like placid arrogance, this superficial confidence with which we live our lives. And it's extraordinary because, the internet was supposed to kind of like bring knowledge to your fingertips, and therefore everybody would be enlightened and so on. In fact, what it appears to have done is that now, even though we have knowledge, it doesn't translate into a dawning realization or an awareness so for example, Hormuz has now been blocked for, since the 28th of February. And everybody knows that oil is slowly running out, and oil is basically what makes our economies run and what creates all of these wonderful pieces of plastic that are giving us cancer. But people are not acting, nor is the price of oil acting as if we have this knowledge. It's this kind of like extraordinary where, since destruction has not come raining upon our heads and turned us into coal, everything will be okay. I'd love to see someone, maybe Aisha, can ruminate a little bit about this extraordinary moment of, I don't know how to call it, like indolence or temptation, suspension.
What a task you've given me. You know, I think when I sort of have a thinking as an intellectual, or when I'm sort of having a thinking as a political thinker, I tend to be quite pessimistic in this moment. Things are so bleak, things are so dire. And I think in many ways we are supposed to accept our own death and the death of our oceans, the death of our kin, the death of our land. We are supposed to be so overwhelmed. And I think technology contributes to that overwhelm, right? We are supposed to be so overwhelmed by the obstacles and by the extent of the ruination that we submit. And, for me, as a fiction writer, it's actually the place where I challenge myself not to accept, right? Not to submit, to sort of force myself to imagine alternatives, however impossible they may seem in the current reality. One thing I was moved by in your piece, Iason, was how well the fishermen knew the sea, right? And they had this ancestral knowledge from their parents and their grandparents. And so they could track the change. And even though so many of them are being blamed, right? These individual small time fishermen blamed for the ruin. And I think there's an importance to reclaiming our own ancestral knowledge and our own ancestral connection to the sea as this sort of gathering site, as a place where we celebrate, where we mourn, where we forge relationships. It's a site that I think allows us to transcend the other markers that perhaps tried to value or devalue us in this current moment.
Aisha, it's funny because as Iason was talking, I was thinking a lot of Muaz in your story and also Muaz's brother, because I think, even though your story, I think it kind of operates at this tension between optimism and pessimism that's really, really beautiful. Because I think that there's one thing that you've done is kind of show us how there is this insistence on life, on continuity, on adaptation, on renewal. And the example of the washing machine, Maaz's brother developing the washing machine out of sort of bits and pieces of junk, I think is an example of that. And I'd like you to maybe talk to me a bit about that, because from what I gather, that was kind of the inciting. You saw something online that kind of inspired you to around that washing machine that kind of inspired the story, if I'm not mistaken. That scene with Muaz in the sea, I think kind of it it was such a beautiful juxtaposition to this idea of being estranged from the environment, where this young man is kind of undergoing this horrible violence and he's still finding moments to kind of reconnect with the world, with the sea. Yeah, so I kind of threw a bunch of things at you, so go ahead, take your pick with whatever you'd like to talk about.
Yeah, I think what I'm interested in doing, not just in this story, but in this moment for me as a writer, is thinking about how defiance and how resistance shows up in the most impossible circumstances and the most unexpected ways. And for me right now, I'm really interested in thinking surveillance technology, surveillance capitalism, its role in actual bodily and physical violence, its role in the degradation of the environment, as this monster that feels impossible to combat. And one thing that's been really inspiring to me is to watch the ways in which Palestinian people in particular have found creative ways to resist this beast. So watching this young man, right, a real video I saw of a young man in Gaza making a washing machine. I watched a video from the Palestinian journalist Bisan Ouda, who had children who were catching sardines with a can. And of course, Palestinians are forbidden to fish in the sea, right? To fish, to access the sea, the coastline right in front of them, which is a lifeline, is forbidden to them. And it's forbidden to them precisely because it is a lifeline, right? And because they do have this ancestral relationship to it. And that is why, right, they're not allowed to sort of access it. And so I tried to think about sort of analog ways that resistance can appear the ways that we can be inspired by we can learn from our ancestors before the advent of some of this deadly technology and use those methods to resist.
Very beautiful. I wanted to ask you all a bit about how you go about writing about a landscape like the Mediterranean, which is kind of overburdened with history and symbolism. And how do you do that? And what kind of responsibilities might come about? Or do you feel when you're writing about a place like that that's kind of saturated with imagery and meaning and contradiction?
I love the issue name Mediterraneans, that plural at the end, that I think I felt gave me massive license to explore those many Mediterraneans that I just feel intimately exist or that I'm struggling with, perhaps. For me, as I was writing it, like I mentioned briefly earlier, I started writing, more about the personal side. I started with my father and I wrote about that, and then I left for a little while and I came back having read more about the ecological side, so I wrote a bit about that, and then more about my recent time there, etc. And so in writing almost multiple separate mini essays, I began to kind of connect them together through a common thread, but they did exist separately for a while almost. And that was, at least for me, the writing process and how I was like externalizing the struggle of what the Mediterranean is and how I'm supposed to relate to it and how I should feel about it. I think there is a lot of responsibilities bound up in writing about these kinds of questions. As a history student, I originally was like, let me write something historical about it. But simply there's so much history, it's so vast that I kind of had to leave that to the side a bit and leave it for people to hopefully bring their own relationships to the Mediterranean, their own knowledge of its histories to it, and to kind of, I see it as a sea of people, and everyone's bringing their own memories, I think we all have a thought instantaneously when we think of the Mediterranean, whether it's a smell or a feeling or the heat or whatever it is. And I like the idea that people come to this kind of piece or these words and bring their own interpretations to fill it in. And I was trying to think of how you leave that space open for everyone to bring their own memories and their own intimacies. If that answers the question at all.
Yeah. I think what's interesting also about your piece is that you kind of almost give the Mediterranean a consciousness. Could you tell me a little bit about that decision? Was it Barry Lopez that you were
in part. I think, well, kind of connecting to what we've spoken about earlier and what I just spoke about so beautifully about our ancestors. And I speak briefly in the piece about like this idea of water lessons that there's you learn to read water. I swim, I sail, I fish sometimes, and I learned all those things on the Mediterranean. And those lessons aren't always easy, but they feel very important to me in retrospect in learning how to read currents and waves and to keep myself safe, of course. And those kinds of lessons that make you feel connected to a much longer thread of human connection to this sea. And in thinking of the Mediterranean as a teacher, I think it's hard to, I use, female pronouns throughout the piece. That's just, I guess, my personal preference, but it feels very much like whenever I return, I'm going home to something that knows me and something that I know, at least in a sense. And of course, the sea is dangerous and the sea is vast, and I've not been in many places to it. But there's always going to be a sense that I'm returning to a place that has sheltered me, a place that has given me a home. And I find it hard to not speak of that as if it is living in some sense.
Does anyone want to jump in on any of the points or answer the question that I had about like responsibilities, about kind of trying to capture that complexity and writing in a very sort of storied. I mean, Aisha, I'd be interested in hearing about your research process, also how you approached writing about a day in life in Gaza. Obviously, you're not in Gaza, so how did you go about doing that research?
I mean, it was a decision I didn't take on lightly, and I think I should always feel a tremendous amount of discomfort. But it also felt to me like the only thing I was capable of writing. I think this story was actually the first new piece I started after the genocide began. And it sort of returned me to myself, returned me to writing. But, I think the way I approached research was really more, instead of thinking of it as more traditional research, I like to think of it as listening and really trying to listen to what people, not only on the ground now in Gaza, are telling us, but also Palestinian ancestors, right, have been telling us for decades. And so I sort of tried to have that lens in mind, even though I did do kind of more maybe traditional research, but I tried to sort of reframe it in my own mind as a task to myself that I need to be an especially good listener now if I'm going to try to tell a story and to give a character, a fictional character, as much complexity as he really deserves.
And yes, and you spoke a little bit at the beginning about the research process for you, but I'd be curious, like what drove you to do this research? I mean, what was it that was kind of sparked?
Realized I'd been writing about the shores around the Mediterranean for a long time, and I didn't know very much about the sea. I had applied and won a grant offered by an entity, Mosaic, and they sponsored journalism. So I took the opportunities. Pretty bleak month in Greece, and I like bleak. So I thought I'd go to the islands, which are much better in the winter than they are in the summer when they're full of tourists and people from cities, a Greek connection to the city, who open their and bars and clubs. They're actually stripped down to their permanent year-round residence. It's that period when people say, the winter in the islands is very hard because you get very lonely and so on. But this painter that I went to have tea with when I was on Limnos, living there since the 80s, and she was like, this is a wonderful period. In the summer, I find myself closing myself up and she wasn't even living in the main port of the island. She was kind of like 25 minutes by motorbike from there. My approach was just basically to go there, speak with captains. Some of them told me some, pretty unscientific stuff. I then cross-referenced it with scientists. I got some support from Med Mosaic. They sent me off to do some extra reporting. I wasn't so interested about the scientific side of things. I was more interested in bringing this vast, watery life for people who, only really relate to it in the sense of, it's a place to swim in or it's just beautiful to look at.
And how do you maintain kind of the sense of urgency in your writing around the environmental crisis without tipping into despair or like hopelessness?
I mean, for the 15 years of my professional life, I was covering the Middle East, so I was pretty used to tipping into despair and also like have a pretty tough skin and never seems to really kind of affect me. Sometimes I bring up that old cliche about, responsibility we have for the people after us, but even that, it's like kind of like it's generational, so it doesn't really have the sort of urgency that we actually need right now. Of course, now it's February the 28th, and since 2022, and even before that, we're pedaling in the opposite direction because instead of kind of like marshaling our very like sparse resources to ourselves, we're actually expending massive and probably ever increasing energy. War is like the most energy intensive process that we can engage in. And now it looks like, now that there's a lot of talk these days about how, we're sagging from one empire to another, from the Americans to the Chinese and so on, it does look like we've got to that point of resource competition, which actually becomes even more compounding on its damage to the environment. So, I've yet to see a really good piece looking at how much damage has been caused to the Red Sea or the Gulf from the conflicts of last summer or going back to 2023, and certainly the Persian Gulf since February the 20th. These are things that we don't really pay a lot of attention to because it's much more urgent to, look at images from Tehran or from Tel Aviv, or to wonder whether Donald Trump will finally get his comeuppance, or whether, the evil regime in Iran is going to get replaced. And so, but hovering over all of the kind of like small day-to-day, soap operas of our geopolitical is the deeper natural reality of what we and our kids are going to end up having to live with. And we're already living with that because And this is really the last thing, sorry to have gone on for so long. But when I was a kid, I grew up in Athens in the 1980s, and I remember going down to the beach, and the sun was not that great, and my mother would slather cream on me because you already had the greenhouse effect. But the fish was really good and cheap, and the water was a lot than it is now. And then we had these kind of like sci-fi scenarios about these dystopian futures where people would go down to the beach, like, to inhale oxygen and so on. We haven't quite got there yet, but things are pretty bad already.
Yeah. I mean, as you were talking, I was just thinking about also just it's also partly our lack of our imagination to think of the Mediterranean as this cohesive whole where everything is kind of connected. Pollution from the genocide in Gaza that is not just going to poison the water in Gaza, it's going to have knock-on effects across the region. And I think that, it goes back to this if we don't have that imagination and if we don't have that relationship around the interconnectedness of all of these things, I think it's very difficult to find urgency.
Yeah, I mean, it's, like Israel used a lot of depleted uranium in its 2006 and 1996 campaigns in Lebanon. When they bombed Dahia, there was a lot of depleted uranium that was used there. I did a documentary at the time, and we went around with Lebanese scientists with their counters, and they were picking up like huge radiation readings. I don't think that this is a fact of lived experience in Beirut. When you go out in Beirut, I don't think that the average Lebanese even has that on their radar, let alone feels that it's something that they need to kind of like talk about or pressure the authorities to clean up and so on. But what fascinates me much more is the idea that, every generation is like horrific things happen in every generation, but then they're kind of replaced by narratives, replaced by official histories. And so the next generation grows up and they have the official history about what happened, and everybody was like terribly no brave and they were like very heroic. Now things are worse, but then they were better. And so these narratives are usually written by the victors. And when you live in a time of great privilege, like the current transition from sort of one status quo to another, it's a particularly relevant time to be uncovering the hidden narratives or the hidden histories that shaped our world. And so, one last thing, about 2 years ago, I finally wrote this kind of trilogy about how Greece and Israel are kind of parallel entities. They're both ethnic based, religion based, to a large extent, countries based on an origin story that goes back to history, that goes back, several thousand years ago, and therefore sort of a right to belonging and so on. Now, you can't exactly compare Greece with Israel because the people that inhabit Greece today are vastly more local in many ways than the people that inhabit Israel today. And also the level of violence involved in creating the Greek identity is much less than the level of that violence involved in creating the Israeli identity. But it was very important for me to uncover these, parallel histories. And for example, point out to people that both the Greek independence movement and the secret society that resulted in the rebellion against the Ottomans and Zionism were basically both created in a cosmopolitan port city of the Black Sea called Odessa. That's where it all started, both for Zionism and for Hellenism. But then, in order to really help people realize this, we word interactive maps where you could scroll and you could see how the Suez Canal allows all of these cultural influences to come in, and how over 250 years you go from a British-dominated maybe to an American-dominated one, and all is to keep the Russians. So that was something that I felt quite proud of having done, because it allowed people to visualize a Mediterranean that was not connected via Paris, New York, or London, and where our common histories are narrative racial exclusivity. You're like Egyptian or Greek or Turkish, we all have our little exclusive narratives, can actually lock against each other, and you can actually find the points of commonality as opposed to the points of difference.
We have a question that I think is interesting to consider by Michaela. They say, aren't you all stunned that these environmental catastrophes are not common knowledge?
I think it relates to what Iason was saying about how we paste over history. And I'm even thinking sort of Mediterranean that I connect to most personally is the Egyptian coastline. My father's hometown is Alexandria, Egypt. And I'm thinking about what's happening along that coastline now in the name of development, in the name of progress, or just a stunning rate of concrete and luxury high rises all up and down what used to be quite, I mean, gorgeous, but also quite rugged coastline. And I'm thinking about how many people I know, even in my own life, who accept this narrative, right? Oh, look what's happening. Isn't it great? Right? And it's not only is of course a disaster for the majority of Egyptian people who are not wealthy and cannot afford to live there, but it's an environmental disaster as well. But I think in this case, it's quite a literal metaphor, right? The sort of literal pasting over of the disaster to our own ruination, right? There is something, yeah, this sort of psychological maneuverings we have to do to keep marching on towards ruin.
Yeah, I don't have much to add for that. I think it's very, very true. One thing I will say to the connection between Greece and Israel as well in the present, that they share a drone contract. So you have the same far-ranging drones tested on Palestinian bodies used by the Greek military to survey the Aegean in particular for migrants attempting to make landings in Greece. And they use these drones that have allowed us to collapse what used to be, the sea used to be impenetrable in many ways. It used to be a place that was free of surveillance historically, and a place where people would escape into and from, that now has become surveilled just like most of the land as well. And instead of using that to rescue, the EU and Frontex and these kinds of military immigration authorities, use it to capture or to repel or even to deliberately let die, as the Greek Coast Guard often is engaged in doing. And that just connects back to earlier points about these surveillances, these technologies of control that can feel very overwhelming, and it can be very easy to allow for this pasting over of narratives, this pasting over of history. But I don't know, we have a responsibility to be alarmed by them and to try and take action wherever we can and to imagine differently.
This goes back to a racial narrative that the Greeks or the Israelis are racially superior to others. We carry the banner of Christian values, etc., etc. And this is something that you see very much in now, because Greece and Israel is tight, which aside from having an enemy in the form of Turkey, is justified by its supporters on exactly these grounds, which is that Greece and Israel are keeping the Muslim barbarian hordes at bay, is basically what it comes down to. And only say we have a refreshingly open level political debate in Greece. It's very politically incorrect. Someone says exactly what they think, which can make place on Greek Facebook. The climate disaster, the destruction of the race. This is how you ignore ethnic cleansing in the West, by creating narratives. Narratives are easy. They don't have to be nuanced. They don't have to partake or deftly. Just collect 3 or 4 true enough points and put them to line that you and another kind of people.
We've got about 5 minutes left, and unless we have more questions, I wanted to ask, on this subject of narratives, what would you hope readers take with them after reading not just your story, but maybe the issue as a whole about the Mediterranean? What kind of stories that you think you'd like readers to take away from this issue when it comes to the Mediterranean?
I mean, one thing I'm reflecting on from this conversation, even, and I'm thinking of a line from your piece, Gabriela, about the Mediterranean as a middle sea, like a dividing line between those who are human and those who are not. I'm paraphrasing. You wrote it much more beautifully than that. But I think something that's been useful for me in this conversation is even how tightly knit all these issues are. So we're thinking about colonialism, we're thinking about environmental disaster, we're thinking about surveillance technology, we're thinking about racism, and thinking about how they collide in the sea, right? And how they serve each other and how interconnected they are. And so for me, that would be one takeaway, right? Is that you can't really think about these questions separately. You have to think about them together to understand them.
Yeah, interconnectivity is a word I return to a lot as well, reflecting on everything about it, from the most literal, like the ecosystems are interconnected, the groundwater, the rivers, the sea is interconnected, but also we as people are, our histories are, the cultures are, the food, all of these things. I think about the Barry Lopez quotes in my essay because I've been reading him and so thinking about him a lot recently. This idea that we love places and they love us back, and how they sustain us, they teach us, they steady us, they feed us, they guide us. This is very much a love letter for me because I love the Mediterraneans perhaps, and returning to that place of love and with that interconnectivity, I think can be quite a powerful idea. And I hope that it can lead us in directions of more collective responsibility and more community, and away from some of these individualistic mindsets, or these mindsets that we are distinct and separate, and that bog us down in some ways.
I wanted to ask as well, now that we're kind of just to close things out, what you imagine for the future of the Mediterranean. When you think about the future of the Mediterranean, what is it that you see? And also a secondary question to that, if there are many Mediterraneans, as we've been talking about, and as this issue suggests, which Mediterranean do you kind of feel close to and that comes to your mind very, very strongly? Maybe that you have more than one that are kind of competing with each other.
Definitely have more than one, but that's the beauty of it. That's for all of us who have more than one Mediterranean, who have multiple Mediterraneans. The idea is that, blending them together actually and enriches your understanding, your appreciation of what you have before you. Don't pretend as a human being to fathom the complexity of the depth of history, of the density of biomass that. But to go back to your original question, which is, what Mediterranean do I see for the future? The Mediterranean we will see emerging over the next years, and already it is a place of highly structured competition and spatial planning. So one of the most interesting things while doing my research was that actually now the Aegean it may appear when you're standing on the deck of a boat in storm in February heading to Limnos from Athens. But in fact, it's incredibly scheduled and programmed, like a bourgeois 8-year-old's afternoon program.
I want to just also throw the question to Gabriela and Aisha, if you have any kind of closing thoughts around what you imagine for the future of the Mediterranean, and if there are any sort of specific Mediterraneans that kind of you feel closest to personally.
Maybe I'll just be like wildly optimistic, idealistic for a moment, which is a challenge for me. Maybe I'll imagine the collapse of borders, which I think is a key step for those of us who have lineage or ancestry or connection to all parts of the Mediterranean to save each other, right? I don't know. I'm going to throw it out there. I think about my own personal connection. I think about being on Stanley Beach in Alexandria, Egypt with my auntie, who always made us get dressed up nicely to go visit the sea, and, to be seen by the sea and to see her in return. And I think about that this particular beach is a place where all walks of life in Egypt, a highly stratified society, could gather. And so that's an image I hold close to me.
I will second a Mediterranean without borders. That would be a very beautiful thing to see. And yeah, I think back on that, many of my oldest memories are from along the Mediterranean, and from a place where you could hear cicadas, you couldn't see concrete maybe, and it was a gentle place. And that's not to deny the sea's capacity to be violent and stormy and all these things that of course it is. But for it, when I think of the future, I like to think of a place where it can be a coming home for anybody and everybody, and not a place that is so stratiated by passports or where you're coming from or names or any of these things that currently divide us.
Thank you. That's a really beautiful way to end. I just want to thank you all for your beautiful contributions. And if you haven't read their essays yet, their essays and fiction, I really, really recommend that you do and explore the rest of the issue. We'll be having another roundtable in a few weeks, so look out for that. But I just wanted to say thank you again for joining us, all three of you. It was really lovely to get a chance to dig in a bit deeper into your writing. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.